The sound of gunfire shattered the morning stillness, sending a flock of startled crows into the air above the small homestead that Ruby Thompson had fought so desperately to keep. It was 1876, 3 years after her husband had died of typhoid, leaving her alone with their modest ranch outside Willow Creek, Arizona territory. Now, as flames consumed the only home she'd known for the past 5 years, Ruby stood frozen, her dark hair blowing wildly in the hot desert wind as the last of her possessions turned to ash before her eyes. The Hargrove gang had finally made good on their threats. For months, they'd been pressuring homesteaders to sell their land to make way for cattle barons moving into the territory. Ruby had refused, even after the warnings, even after her neighbors had packed up and fled. Now she had nothing but the clothes on her back and her husband's pocket watch clutched in her trembling hand. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats over the roar of the fire. When a deep voice called out behind her, Ruby spun around, grabbing for the small derringer hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Easy there, madam," the stranger said, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "Looks like you've had yourself some trouble." He sat tall in the saddle, this unknown cowboy with broad shoulders and a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, a striking shade of blue, assessed the situation quickly. Behind him rode two other men similarly dressed in trail-worn clothes, dust coating their hats and bandanas. Hargroves. He asked simply, nodding toward the burning building. Ruby nodded, too shocked to speak as she watched the last support beam of her home collapse in a shower of sparks. "Name's Logan Dawson," the man said, dismounting in one fluid motion. "These are my brothers, Caleb and Ethan. We've been tracking those bastards, pardon my language, for 3 days now." Ruby finally found her voice. "Why would you be tracking them?" "They shot up a stagecoach 2 counties over, killed the driver and a passenger. U.S. Marshal in Fort Benson deputized us to bring them in." Logan looked at the ruins of her home, his expression grim. "Appears we're too late to stop them here." Ruby felt her legs weaken beneath her. Everything she owned, everything she had worked so hard to preserve after her husband's death gone. The vegetable garden she'd tended, the new roof she'd put on last autumn with her own hands, the furniture she'd brought all the way from St. Louis. All reduced to cinders. "I have nothing left," she said, her voice barely audible as she sank to her knees in the dirt. The cowboy knelt beside her, his presence solid and reassuring in a world that had suddenly become untethered. "Then you'll have us instead," Logan replied, his voice gentle but firm. "My brothers and I don't leave folks stranded, especially not when Hargrove's men are involved." Ruby looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes. You don't know me anything." "Don't need to know you to know what's right," Logan said simply. He nodded to his youngest brother. "Ethan, see if you can salvage anything useful from what's left once it's cooled. Caleb, keep watch." They might circle back. Ruby watched as the men moved with practiced efficiency, and for the first time since the attack, she felt something other than despair, a small flutter of hope. "We'll ride for Willow Creek," Logan said. "Get you situated at the hotel, then we'll continue after Hargrove." "No," Ruby said, standing up and brushing the dirt from her skirt. "I'm going with you." Logan's eyebrows shot up. "Madam, tracking outlaws isn't—" "My name is Ruby Thompson, not madam," she interrupted. "And those men took everything I had. I want to see them brought to justice." "It's dangerous work," Logan warned. "My life here was dangerous work," Ruby countered. "I've been fighting to keep this land for 3 years on my own. I can shoot, I can ride, and I have nothing to lose." Logan studied her for a long moment, those piercing blue eyes seeming to look straight through to her soul. Finally, he nodded. "All right, Mrs. Thompson, but you follow our lead, understood?" Ruby squared her shoulders. "Understood." By midday, they had packed what little they could salvage: a cast iron skillet, a few pieces of silverware that had survived the fire, and a small wooden box containing her husband's letters. Ruby mounted the spare horse the Dawson brothers had brought along, feeling a curious mixture of grief and determination as they rode away from the smoking ruins of her homestead. As they traveled, she learned that the Dawson brothers had been working as bounty hunters for nearly 2 years, ever since drought had claimed their family ranch in Texas. Logan, the eldest at 32, had a reputation for being fair but relentless. Criminals feared him, but honest folks in towns across the territory welcomed the Dawson brothers' presence. "The Hargroves have been moving west," Logan explained as they made camp that evening, a small fire crackling between them. "Started in New Mexico, pushing smaller ranchers out, burning what they couldn't buy." "But why?" Ruby asked, accepting the tin cup of coffee Ethan handed her. "Land speculation," Caleb said, his voice deeper than Logan's but with the same hint of a Texas drawl. "Railroads coming through. Land that's worth pennies now will be worth dollars once the tracks are laid." Ruby's fingers tightened around the cup. "So my husband died defending worthless land that only became valuable after he was gone." "Not worthless," Logan said quietly. "Never worthless. Just undervalued by men who see dollar signs instead of homes." His words touched something in Ruby, a recognition that he understood what the land meant beyond its monetary worth. For the first time, she really looked at him, and saw more than just a cowboy with a gun. She saw a man who carried his own losses behind those blue eyes. They rode for Willow Creek the next morning, a journey that would take them 2 days. Ruby had rarely ventured far from her homestead in recent years, and despite the circumstances, she found herself noticing the beauty of the terrain, the way the sun painted the distant mesas gold and crimson, how the sagebrush released its pungent scent when brushed by their horses' legs. That night, as Caleb and Ethan slept, Ruby found Logan still awake, staring into the dying embers of their campfire. "You should rest," she said softly, settling beside him. Logan glanced at her, then back at the fire. "Never been much good at sleeping under the stars, too quiet sometimes." "I always thought it was too loud," Ruby admitted. "All those night creatures, the wind in the grass." A small smile touched the corners of Logan's mouth. "Guess it depends on what demons you're running from." "And what demons are you running from, Mr. Dawson?" Ruby asked before she could stop herself. He was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, same as most men, I suppose, regrets, choices I can't take back. "Is that why you hunt men like Hargrove, to make up for something?" Logan picked up a stick and stirred the embers. "Maybe, or maybe it's just what I'm good at." He looked at her then, his expression softening. "What about you? What will you do after if we catch them?" The question caught Ruby off guard. She hadn't thought beyond finding justice for the destruction of her home. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have some money saved in the bank in Willow Creek. Not much, but enough to start over somewhere, I suppose." "You could rebuild," Logan suggested. Ruby shook her head. "Not alone, and not there with those memories." They fell silent, the night sounds filling the space between them. Ruby found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw beneath his beard, the way his hands, rough and calloused from years of hard work, handled even the smallest task with a surprising gentleness. "We should reach town by tomorrow evening," Logan said finally. "You can rest at the hotel while we gather information on Hargrove's whereabouts." "I told you I'm coming with you," Ruby reminded him. Logan turned to face her fully. "Mrs. Thompson, Ruby, this isn't some adventure. These men are killers." "I know exactly what they are," she said, her voice steady despite the anger that flared at his words. "They're the men who destroyed everything I built, and I won't sit in some hotel room waiting for news like a proper lady. Not anymore." Something flickered in Logan's eyes, respect, perhaps, or recognition of the steel beneath her grief. He nodded once. "All right, but if it comes to shooting, you stay behind us." "I can handle a gun, Mr. Dawson." "Logan," he corrected. "And I don't doubt your abilities, only your experience with men who shoot back." Ruby couldn't argue with that. She'd fired her rifle at predators threatening her chickens and once to scare off a drunken drifter, but never in a gunfight. "Fair enough, Logan." His name felt strange on her lips, intimate somehow, despite the formality that still existed between them. But as she returned to her bedroll, Ruby felt a curious warmth that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the desert day. Willow Creek greeted them the following evening, a dusty collection of wooden buildings strung along a single main street. Ruby had visited only occasionally since her husband's death, preferring the solitude of her homestead to the curious glances and pitying looks from townspeople. Now, as they rode past the general store and the small church, she felt exposed, her loss visible to anyone who might recognize her. They stopped first at the sheriff's office, only to find it occupied by a deputy barely old enough to grow a proper beard. He listened to Logan's explanation of their pursuit of the Hargrove gang with wide eyes. "Sheriff Wilson's up in Cedar Ridge for the circuit judge," he explained nervously. "Won't be back for a week at least, but there was a fellow asking about strangers in town just yesterday, rough-looking sort. Said he was looking for his brothers." Logan exchanged a look with Caleb. "Hargrove checking if anyone's following," Caleb said under his breath. "Did he say where they were headed?" Logan asked the deputy. "No, sir. But Jeb over at the livery mentioned something about a group of riders heading toward the old Prescott mining road." They gathered supplies quickly after that: ammunition, food, fresh bandanas to cover their faces against the dust. Ruby insisted on purchasing new trousers and a sturdy shirt from the general store, ignoring the scandalized look from the shopkeeper's wife. "More practical than skirts for riding," she said simply, when Logan raised an eyebrow at her purchases. They took rooms at the modest hotel for the night, planning to leave at first light. Ruby stood awkwardly in the hallway outside her door, suddenly unsure of herself now that they were back in civilization. "Try to get some rest," Logan said, his voice low. "Tomorrow will be a hard ride." Ruby nodded, but as she turned to enter her room, she found herself saying, "Thank you for not leaving me there with nothing." Logan's expression softened. "Get some sleep, Ruby." That night, alone in the narrow hotel bed, Ruby found sleep elusive. Her mind kept returning to the image of her burning home, but increasingly, those thoughts were interrupted by others: the way Logan's hand had steadied her elbow as she dismounted, the quiet confidence in his voice when he spoke, the unexpected kindness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. She told herself it was natural to feel drawn to someone who had helped her in her darkest moment. Natural, but dangerous. Logan Dawson was a man who lived by the gun, who pursued dangerous men across unforgiving territory. He wasn't the kind to settle down to build something lasting. And Ruby wasn't sure she had it in her to start over again, to risk losing everything a second time. Yet when morning came and she met the brothers in the hotel dining room, Ruby couldn't deny the quickening of her pulse when Logan looked up and smiled at her approach. They rode out as the sun crested the eastern hills, following the Prescott mining road as it wound through increasingly rugged terrain. Ruby's new clothing proved its worth as they navigated narrow trails and steep inclines. By midday, they had climbed high enough that the desert spread out below them like a vast golden sea. "There," Caleb said suddenly, pointing to a thin column of smoke rising from a cluster of rocks about 2 miles ahead. "Could be a campfire." Logan studied the smoke through a small spyglass. 4 horses, could be them." They approached cautiously, leaving their horses tethered in a sheltered ravine as they continued on foot. Ruby's heart hammered in her chest, but her hands remained steady as she checked her revolver, a well-maintained Colt that had belonged to her husband. "Stay behind me," Logan whispered as they neared the camp. "Ethan, circle around to the east. Caleb west. If it's them, we take them by surprise. No shooting unless necessary. We want them alive for the bounty and the trial." Ruby nodded, her mouth too dry for speech. As they crept closer, voices became audible, rough, male voices punctuated by occasional laughter. Then she heard a name that made her blood run cold. "Hargrove says we wait here till he sends word," one voice was saying. "Don't like it much, but after that business with the Thompson woman, we're laying low." Logan's hand shot out, gripping Ruby's arm as she instinctively moved forward. He shook his head in warning, then gestured for her to follow him as they repositioned for a better view of the camp. 4 men sat around a small fire, passing a bottle between them. Ruby recognized 2 of them immediately, the same men who had torched her home while she hid in the root cellar, emerging only after they'd ridden away. Rage coursed through her, hot and blinding. Logan must have sensed her tension because his hand moved to cover hers where it gripped the revolver. Not yet, he breathed, his lips close to her ear. Wait for the signal. The waiting was unbearable, seconds stretching into minutes as they watched the outlaws and waited for Caleb and Ethan to get into position. Then, just as the sound of a mockingbird call Ethan's signal reached them, one of the men stood up and stretched. Going to check the horses, he announced, heading directly toward their hiding place. There was no time to retreat. The outlaw rounded the boulder and came face to face with Logan and Ruby. For a split second, everyone froze. Then the man reached for his gun. Logan moved faster, tackling the outlaw before he could draw. They went down in a tangle of limbs and dust, the outlaw's shout alerting his companions. Gunfire erupted from the camp as the remaining men dove for cover. "Get down," Logan shouted at Ruby, struggling to subdue the man beneath him. But Ruby had already taken aim at one of the outlaws who was raising his rifle toward where she knew Ethan must be positioned. She squeezed the trigger, her shot going wide but causing the man to duck back down. Caleb's voice rang out from the western edge of the camp. "Drop your weapons." "You're surrounded." One of the outlaws apparently decided to test this claim, firing rapidly in Caleb's direction. Ruby saw Logan finally land a solid punch that rendered his opponent unconscious, then roll away to draw his own weapon. The gunfight was brief but intense. When it ended, one outlaw lay dead, another wounded, and the remaining two, including the man Logan had subdued, were disarmed and bound with rope from their own supplies. "Anyone hurt?" Logan called out, his voice steady despite the tension of the past few minutes. "Grazed my arm," Ethan reported, emerging from his position with a blood-stained sleeve. "Nothing serious." Ruby stood shakily, her ears ringing from the gunfire. She looked down at the captured men, searching their faces. "Which one of you set fire to my home?" she demanded. The wounded outlaw spat on the ground. "Don't know what you're talking about, lady. She's talking about the Thompson place," Logan said coldly, pressing the barrel of his gun against the man's temple. "The homestead you boys torched yesterday morning." Something like fear flickered in the outlaw's eyes. That was Hargrove's orders, said to make an example of anyone who wouldn't sell. "Where is Hargrove now?" Caleb asked, binding the wounded man's arm with a strip of cloth. "Don't know. Supposed to meet us here in 3 days." "That's all I know, I swear." Logan looked at Ruby, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded once, a gesture that said she believed the man was telling the truth. "Then we wait," Logan decided. 3 days, Hargrove comes to us." They made camp a short distance from the outlaw's position, keeping the prisoners bound and under constant watch. As night fell, Ruby found herself sitting beside Logan again, the events of the day leaving her both exhausted and oddly exhilarated. "You handled yourself well back there," Logan said quietly. "Most people would have frozen up in their first gunfight." "I was terrified," Ruby admitted. "But also, I don't know, it felt like I was finally doing something instead of just having things happen to me." Logan nodded in understanding. "That's how I felt the first time I stood up to my father," he said, surprising her with this glimpse into his past. "He was a mean drunk, used to take it out on me and my brothers. One day I just decided I wasn't going to let him hurt us anymore." "What happened?" "I was 17. Bigger than him by then, he never raised a hand to any of us again." Logan poked at the fire with a stick. "Left home the next year, took Caleb and Ethan with me when our mother died." Ruby studied his profile, understanding now the protectiveness he showed toward his brothers, the responsibility he carried. "You've been taking care of them a long time." "Someone had to," he said simply. Then, changing the subject, "What about you? How'd you end up homesteading out here?" Ruby smiled faintly at the memory. "My husband Thomas had grand dreams of building something out of nothing. We came west from Missouri right after we married. I was 19, thought it was terribly romantic." "And was it?" "Sometimes. Sometimes it was just hard. The first year our crops failed. The second year Apache raiders took our only milk cow, but we kept going, started to make something good." Her smile faded. "Then the typhoid came through. Thomas was gone in a week. Everyone said I should sell up, go back east to my family, but it was our place, ours. I couldn't just leave it." "And now?" Logan asked softly. Ruby looked up at the star-filled sky, surprised to find that the crushing grief she'd felt watching her home burn had transformed into something else, a muted sadness, yes, but also a curious sense of freedom. Now I don't know. Everything that tied me to that place is gone. Logan was silent for a moment. When this is done, when we've brought Hargrove in, what then? The question hung between them, laden with meaning beyond the simple words. Ruby met his gaze, finding something in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. I haven't thought that far ahead, she said truthfully. Maybe you should, Logan suggested, his voice low. Maybe we both should. Before Ruby could respond, Ethan approached with fresh coffee and the moment passed. But later, as she lay in her bedroll trying to sleep, Ruby found herself contemplating possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider since Thomas's death. The next 2 days passed in a strange sort of limbo. They kept the prisoners securely bound, taking turns standing watch. The outlaws had little to offer in the way of useful information, but it became clear that Hargrove's operation was larger than they'd initially thought, a network of hired guns and corrupt officials spanning several territories. Ruby found herself drawn to Logan more with each passing hour. She watched him care for his wounded brother, negotiate firmly but fairly with their prisoners, plan meticulously for Hargrove's arrival. Here was a man who understood justice but wasn't consumed by vengeance, who carried his authority with a quiet dignity rather than bravado. On the evening of the third day, as the sun began its descent behind the western ridges, Caleb spotted riders approaching 3 men moving cautiously up the mining road. "That'll be Hargrove," Logan said, checking his weapons one final time. "Remember the plan. Let them get close enough to identify, then we show ourselves. They're likely to shoot rather than surrender, so be ready." Ruby nodded, her mouth dry but her hands steady. They had positioned themselves strategically around the outlaws' original camp, with the prisoners gagged and hidden from immediate view. As the riders approached, she could make out their features, a heavy-set man with a bushy beard in the lead, flanked by 2 younger men with similar features. "The Hargrove brothers," Logan whispered from his position beside her. "Frank, the one with the beard, is the ringleader. Other 2 are his sons, Will and John." The riders slowed as they neared the camp, clearly sensing something amiss when no one greeted them. Frank Hargrove's hand moved to his gun. "That's far enough, Hargrove," Logan called out, rising from behind a boulder with his rifle aimed squarely at the older man's chest. Caleb and Ethan revealed themselves simultaneously, creating a triangle of firepower around the new arrivals. For a moment, no one moved. Then Frank Hargrove laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the rocks. "Well, if it isn't the Dawson boys, still playing at being lawmen, I see." "We're not playing," Logan said evenly. "We're taking you in for murder, arson, and robbery. Throw down your weapons." Instead of complying, Frank nodded almost imperceptibly to his sons. In an instant, all 3 Hargroves drew their guns, firing as they dove from their horses for cover. Ruby had been instructed to stay hidden until the shooting stopped, but when she saw one of the younger Hargroves taking aim at Logan's exposed side, she acted on instinct. Her shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing his own shot to go wild. The ensuing gunfight was chaotic and deafening. Ruby kept low, firing only when she had a clear shot. She saw Caleb take down the other son with a shot to the leg, then watched in horror as Frank Hargrove, wounded but still dangerous, charged toward Logan's position. The 2 men collided in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle, Hargrove's greater weight giving him an advantage as they grappled for control of Logan's weapon. Ruby started forward, but Ethan reached them first, bringing the butt of his rifle down on Hargrove's head with a sickening crack. When the dust settled, Frank Hargrove lay unconscious, his sons wounded but alive, and all 3 Dawson brothers were standing, though Logan sported a bloody gash across his cheekbone. "You all right?" Logan asked Ruby, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm fine," she assured him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the relief evident in his expression. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "That shot you took, Will Hargrove would have had me dead to rights." Consider it partial payment for saving mine, Ruby replied, a small smile touching her lips despite the gravity of the moment. They bound the Hargroves securely, tending to their wounds with the same basic care they'd shown the other prisoners. By the time night fell, the full complement of the Hargrove gang was secured and ready for transport back to Willow Creek the following morning. As they sat by the fire that night, a tangible sense of accomplishment hung in the air. The mission that had brought them together was nearly complete, justice served for Ruby's home and for the others who had suffered at Hargrove's hands. Yet beneath that satisfaction ran a current of uncertainty about what would come next. What will you do with the reward money? Ruby asked, breaking the contemplative silence. Logan looked up from cleaning his gun. Split it with my brothers. Beyond that, he shrugged, never really thought past the next bounty. And you, Caleb asked Ruby, will you try to rebuild your place? Ruby shook her head. No. That chapter of my life is closed now. I might head to California. I've always wanted to see the ocean. A shadow seemed to pass over Logan's features. California's a long way. It is, Ruby agreed, watching him carefully. Unless I had a reason to stay closer. Their eyes met across the fire and something unspoken passed between them, a question, a possibility, a future neither had dared to articulate. Later, as the others slept, Logan found Ruby standing at the edge of their camp, gazing at the stars. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. I've been thinking, he said after a moment, about what comes after tomorrow. Ruby turned to look at him. And I'm wondering if maybe it's time I stopped chasing bounties and started building something more permanent. His voice was low, uncertain in a way she hadn't heard before. If I were to buy some land, maybe near Willow Creek, would that be a reason enough for you to reconsider California? Ruby's heart quickened. That would depend on what else might be offered besides land. Logan's hand found hers in the darkness, rough calluses against her equally work-hardened skin. A partnership, he said, equal stakes in whatever we might build, and companionship if you wanted it. Companionship, Ruby repeated, a smile playing at her lips. Is that what they're calling it these days? A slow grin spread across Logan's face, transforming his usually serious expression. Well, I could be more specific about my intentions, Mrs. Thompson, but I wouldn't want to scandalize you. Ruby laughed softly. I think we're well past that point, Mr. Dawson. He turned to face her fully then, his free hand coming up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. I know it's fast. I know we've only just met, but I can't remember the last time I met a woman with your kind of courage. Your kind of heart. Even if that heart's still healing, Ruby asked, suddenly serious. Especially then, Logan said, because mine is too, has been for a long time. Ruby studied his face in the moonlight, the strength in his jaw, the kindness in his eyes, the scar that told of past battles. Here was a man who understood loss, who knew what it meant to fight for what mattered. A man who had appeared when she had nothing and offered not charity but partnership. I think, she said slowly, that California can wait, at least until we see if this partnership is viable. Logan's smile was answer enough, but his next action spoke volumes more as he leaned down to press his lips gently against hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand, but when Ruby's arms slid around his neck in response, it deepened into something that held both promise and certainty. When they finally broke apart, Logan rested his forehead against hers. I can't promise it will be easy, he said. But I can promise you won't face it alone, not ever again. Then I'll have you instead, Ruby whispered, echoing his words from days before, you and whatever we build together. Morning brought the practical tasks of preparing the prisoners for transport, but something fundamental had shifted. As they rode back toward Willow Creek with their captives in tow, Ruby found herself looking forward rather than back, planning for possibilities rather than mourning what was lost. The citizens of Willow Creek emerged from their homes and businesses as the unusual procession made its way down the main street. Word of the Dawson brothers' success in capturing the notorious Hargrove gang spread quickly, and by the time they reached the sheriff's office, a small crowd had gathered. The deputy, wide-eyed with excitement, sent telegrams to Fort Benson and the territorial marshal's office. Within hours, confirmation came back. The reward for the Hargroves stood at $1,500 to be paid upon delivery of the prisoners to the territorial courthouse. Enough for a decent piece of land, Logan noted quietly to Ruby as they stood outside the telegraph office. Maybe that parcel north of town with the creek running through it. Sounds promising, Ruby agreed, a warmth spreading through her at the casual way he included her in his plans, though it would need a proper house. I'm handy with a hammer, Logan said with a smile. And Caleb's a fair hand at carpentry. We could have something built before winter. The easy confidence in his voice, the way he spoke of their future as something certain, filled Ruby with a joy she hadn't expected to feel again. 3 days ago, she had stood watching her past burn to ashes. Now, somehow, she was planning a future with a man who had ridden into her life as unexpectedly as a summer storm. That evening, as they shared a meal at the hotel restaurant, Ethan raised his glass in a toast. To new beginnings, he said, glancing meaningfully between Ruby and his older brother. And to justice served, Caleb added, clinking his glass against the others. Logan's hand found Ruby's under the table, his fingers intertwining with hers as naturally as if they'd been doing it for years. To finding something worth building, he said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. When you thought there was nothing left, Ruby smiled, squeezing his hand in return. To us, she said simply, knowing that in that word us lay everything she needed to begin again. 3 months later, as autumn painted the countryside in golds and crimsons, Ruby stood on the porch of their newly completed cabin, watching as Logan and his brothers unloaded supplies from town. The land they had purchased, 40 acres of good grazing land with timber and water, was already showing signs of becoming a home. Fences marked boundaries, a small barn housed their horses, and garden beds waited for spring planting. Logan looked up, catching her eye across the yard, and smiled that slow, genuine smile that never failed to quicken her pulse. He handed the reins of his horse to Caleb and made his way to where she stood. "Something on your mind, Mrs. Dawson?" he asked, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. The name still felt new on her ears, though they had been married for nearly 2 months now, a simple ceremony in the Willow Creek Church with half the town in attendance. Ruby had worn a new dress of blue calico, and Logan had appeared in a suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. "Just thinking about how quickly life can change," she said, leaning into him as his arm circled her waist. 4 months ago, I thought I'd lost everything. And now, Logan prompted, his voice warm against her hair. Ruby turned in his embrace to face him, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "Now I have everything that matters, a home, purpose." She smiled up at him. "Love." Logan's eyes darkened at that last word, and he lowered his head to capture her lips in a kiss that spoke of promises kept and dreams shared. When they parted, breathless, the world around them seemed brighter somehow, more vibrant with possibility. "You know," Logan said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking we might want to add on to the cabin come spring." "Oh," Ruby raised an eyebrow, "planning on inviting more Dawsons to join us." A slow smile spread across Logan's face. "Eventually, if you're amenable." Ruby laughed, the sound clear and joyful in the autumn air. "I might be persuaded," she said, pulling him down for another kiss. Behind them, Caleb cleared his throat dramatically. "If you two could postpone the honeymoon activities until after we've unloaded these supplies, that would be appreciated." Logan grinned against Ruby's lips before reluctantly pulling away. "Duty calls," he said with a mock sigh, "but we'll continue this discussion later." "I'll hold you to that, Cowboy," Ruby promised, watching as he rejoined his brothers. As the men worked, Ruby let her gaze wander over the land that was now their home, not just a replacement for what she had lost, but something new and better, because it was built on choice rather than circumstance, on partnership rather than solitude. Where once she had said, "I have nothing left," now Ruby Thompson Dawson had everything: a family forged in fire, a love born of loss, and a future as wide open as the western sky.